Hello and welcome to the fourth video from the Kawasaki channel. This video is entitled How to Disassemble Anything. It's a bit of a dry video, but it shows a method of disassembling items so that you can reassemble them without missing any parts, and also making sure that any screws go in the correct holes so you don't cause any damage or lose any functionality. I wanted to post this video so that you can see how I disassemble things with my experience of disassembling items and then being able to put them back together again correctly. But it's one of those that isn't going to be quite as entertaining as others may be, but it serves a purpose. So bear that in mind when watching the video, and it's simply to show this process so that you can follow it and successfully disassemble, then reassemble items that you're repairing. I did film this entire video before I shot this small part, so I might repeat myself in the video with things I've said now, but just bear that in mind. It was also supposed to be video 2, but I've moved it to video 4 so people don't think that they're all going to be like this. Yeah, just watch it, see what you think, see if the process is for you. When I disassemble items later on in further videos, I will create disassembly maps that fit this process. So if you want to follow those to disassemble or reassemble an item similar to one that I've done, it would be handy to have seen this video first. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. The videos system on YouTube, if you don't have as many subscribers, even if people are watching the videos, it doesn't bring it up for other people to see as often. So it's quite important, especially to get your first 1,000 subscribers. Thanks a lot.
Over the years, I've had the delightful task of repairing many items where someone else has taken it apart and put it back together in a rather substandard way. There are many jokes relating to how the repairers save a number of items, usually screws, springs or washers, but large companies don't include parts that are not needed, and with some companies the parts are very specific to their locations. There are in fact a lot of anecdotes relating to damage being caused by putting the wrong screw in the wrong hole. This includes the famous Apple long screw damage, which exists for various devices. My previous MacBook Pro was a 2012 Retina model, and to hold the fan in place there were 3 screws of differing lengths. If the longest screw was inserted in the shortest hole, it would damage the laptop. As a repairer of electronic device, I will take something apart and then have to put it back together maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. This might be due to time or having to order a part. Without some form of notes, it could be impossible to remember which screw goes into which hole, so I developed a technique which I've used for 30 years. This technique also helps when you take something apart for a second time or repair another item of the same type. You can refer to your notes and find problems caused by someone else who may have reassembled the item in a somewhat less than careful manner, missing screws or putting things in the wrong place. My technique is simple and idiot proof, plus it only requires a few cheap and simple things: a box to put everything into, fishing tackle boxes or parts boxes, sealable plastic bags, some scraps of paper and a notepad. What I'm going to do today is to disassemble a complicated piece of electronics, a Samsung NF110, in a methodical, logical way, noting every single component. This way I can put it back together exactly as it came apart. So first of all, we need to locate the first point of entry. This can be complicated for someone taking apart an item they are not familiar with, but using this technique we can minimise the issues. Okay. The item we're taking apart, as I said, is this Samsung NF110. It's been lying around the workshop for a while. It's not charged up. I don't even know if it works, but basically this is just to give you an idea of how this method works. I always keep any parts boxes that I get components in, and I number them. I tend to number them so that they've all got different ranges. This one goes from 1 to 15. This one goes from 20 to 31. It just allows me to use more than one box for a single disassembly. This box, for instance, has larger holes in it. This one smaller. I'm going to use this box for this particular project. And it goes from 20 to 31. I don't expect that it will require more than that, but I can always go to the other box later on if I want to. And I'm going to need some paper. Normally I would use a notepad, but in this instance I'm going to use sheets of paper, which makes it easier to show people as we go along. So we start off by taking a look at the laptop and removing anything that obviously comes off before we start, such as the battery, which I will put into the basket. Anything else? Nothing obvious. Okay, so battery's off, and I've decided that I'm going to open it from the back. There are no obvious screws anywhere else, so back it is. What we do is we draw a diagram and make sure that we know which way round the item was. So this is going to be step 1, and very roughly draw the laptop or whatever item you're doing, and include anything on it that makes it obvious which direction it is. So I've put on the diagram battery, and then draw a circle for each screw that you can see on the back. And in the words of Back to the Future, not to scale or painted. Okay, so we now have this diagram which shows us where the screws are. And we start off by removing the first screw. And that can go into the first compartment. That compartment is number 20. So I'm going to label that screw with number 20. Then I'm going to go to the next screw, remove that. Now, what I need to do now is I've taken out a second screw. I need to see if that screw is the same as one of the ones I've got already. Well, I've only got one so far, and they are identical. So I put it into the same compartment as the first one and write that compartment number again on the diagram, and I work my way round. Next one, exactly the same again, so I write 20 next to the screw. Now the 3 at the bottom are slightly shorter. So I'm going to put those into 21, and I label those with 21. Now, looking at the back here, I've got 2 that are labelled keyboard. These may well hold the keyboard in place, which is likely. That's always a bad sign. That screw's been out before. Now these screws, I can't be sure they're the same. Not exactly certain, so I'll just stick them in another pot. 22. And the memory compartment has another screw. Yeah, that's definitely different. So that's going to go in 23. Now I can remove the memory compartment door. It's very obvious where that goes, so I'm not going to label that. I'm going to put that in the basket. Memory stick. Now if this was an expensive or a customer one, this would go in an anti-static bag, but I'm just going to put it in the basket. Okay, so all the screws are removed. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to see how the item should go together. Now, or come apart, sorry. I'm going to use this device here called a spudger. Basically, it's a plastic lever, so it causes little damage, if anything, to the device. And I can see the edge at the rear is slightly apart due to the screws being removed. So I'm going to start there, and I'm going to put the hook of the spudger into the gap, and I'm going to run it along, and you can feel the little clips that hold it together just popping open until it gets to the front where it's a bit tighter. So I'm going to go round and do the same the other direction. Okay, so it's come away at the back, but something's holding it for the front. So I'm going to have a look round, make sure there's no keys under no screws under the keyboard. Okay, even though I've removed those keyboard screws, the keyboard doesn't appear to want to come out. So it must be something else. A favourite is putting screws under labels, so I'm going to check that now by running my finger over. There's a bit of an indentation there, but not big enough for a screw, so we must have missed something. Okay, the SD card, it's not a door, that's a blank, it's a filler. So I'm going to take that out, pop that in, see if that makes a difference. And it does. Okay, so that's the back. Now, when removing backs, keyboards and other things, always make sure that you check that there aren't any cables attaching the back to the front that you're going to rip off. It's always worth spending a moment or two checking, because it's a lot quicker to do that check than it is to resolder a connector, even if you have the expertise to do it, back onto the board. So it doesn't appear that there's anything there. Let's use the spudger again. This corner's not coming undone. Just run the spudger from the other side and it's gone. Back from this side. That's it. It seems to have got released now, but I'm going to be careful when I remove it, just in case. Yep, there we are. So that's the back. The hard disk had fallen out, so it looks like the hard disk, yep, the hard disk is just wrapped in a rubber carrier and held in by the back. So if this task was that we were replacing the hard disk with an SSD or something like that, then we've already got to the point where we can just pull the connector off, put the SSD on, away we go. It's obvious where the hard disk goes, so I'm just going to pop that in the back. Right, so that is step one complete. So I'm now going to switch to step two. So exactly the same as before, label step two. Draw the computer or other item you're doing, and I'm going to put where the battery would be onto that diagram, so I know which direction it is. You can even label after it, so inside, so you don't get confused. Okay, so we have a number of screw holes here, and if you look at the diagram, you can see this screw here, a hole here, this one here, this one here. These are where the screws that came from the back went straight through the back and into it. So that will be one of the 21 screws. But if I'm coming to assemble this in a month's time, I'm not going to remember that these holes are where the screws come through. So I'm going to draw all the holes on the computer, on the page again. So these are all of them, including the ones, the new ones. Take your time not to miss any. Okay, so that's all of those. And I'm going to draw the fan in place. Or other sort of items. It just makes it easier to identify where things were. The CPU cover has 2 screws on it, and the Wi-Fi board also has 2 screws. Okay, as you can see from that. Now looking at it, the Wi-Fi board, there isn't a screw in the left hand side, only the right hand side. So what we do now is we mark up which of the holes don't actually have screws by putting a cross through them. And we end up with this on the diagram. That way we know that screws don't go in there and we haven't missed one. And I'm going to put the hinges on as well. And if you look, that looks like a little bump upwards, which it locates on, like a locating thing. I'm going to put a cross through those as well, so I don't think of screws from there. And I end up with this. So I've got these screws to take out if I need to take them out. Oh, sorry, that was the centre of the fan. Okay, so I'm going to remove the Wi-Fi board. So I undo that screw and put it in number 24 and label it 24. Use an arrow with a line from it if you need to, just to make sure, just so that you can find it. And I'm going to pop that out. Now, Wi-Fi boards, the aerial leads are connected to the board using these push-on things. They're not designed for continuously being removed and put back together, removed and put back together. If we don't need to disconnect them, we're not going to. So I'm going to put that to one side. If we did, we can put a number on the we can put a number on the diagram for the Wi-Fi board and pop it in a component box, or just pop it in the back if we're going to remember that that's what it is, which you would do really. So we now have the board. These 2 screws here look like they go through to the back of the keyboard, so that might explain why the keyboard wasn't coming off. But I'm going to start taking them off now. They're different again, so that goes in 25. And take this one out. That's the same as that one, so that goes in 25 as well. These are the kinds of screws that if you put a long screw in instead of a short one, it'll go into the keyboard or do some other serious damage to the computer. Right, so so cables. This is the hard disk cable, it plugs on there. I'm not going to remove it because I don't need to. There's a screw underneath there. We had the hole written on that. That's the same as the last two, so I can go in 25 as well. Okay, now there's some metal tabs here that hold the board from that side. So I'm going to look over at this side. Now, these two leads here plug in. One is probably about 40 way, and the other's 4 way. So it's obvious which lead goes where. So you don't really need to label that unless you take the lead off completely. So that is the video connector, and that goes through the hinge to the video. So I've carefully taken that one off. And just be careful taking the connectors off, because it only takes a moment. Any time you can save a lot of time by yanking them, but then you've got a massive job of having to put new sockets on. So it's better to take your time. Right, so I've pulled these off. I'm not going to label them. There is a connector here that has nothing on it and didn't have. So what I might well do there is actually just put on a label, empty connector. Right, so we now have everything obvious off the board. Now I'm going to see if, oh, there's another cable here, but again, same as the last one. It doesn't need labelling because there's only one place it can go. Right, so okay, so that's come free at that side. It looks like the screws for the fan go right through and hold the board in as well. So now I'm going to have to remove those. And they go in. That first one goes in 26. Second one's the same, goes in 26. So I labelled those. Didn't have screw holes on there, so I'm going to put them on now. And right, the board is now loose. I'll look, just it's something's holding it in place. Always worth doing is checking underneath. Yeah, there's a ribbon cable attaching the keyboard. Yeah, it's going to be the keyboard to the circuit board. And there's a second one here which looks like the touchpad. So that's the touchpad one, and there's one for the keyboard underneath. So these flat cables, they push in and they're held by these anchor points. So what you do is you just push them away, push the anchor point away, just push it a little bit from each side until it's loose. Once that's loose like that, you can then pull the little blue tab, and that's now released the touchpad. We now have just the keyboard attaching it. So let's have a look. Okay, right, so the keyboard is now holding it in place. What we need to do now is we need to remove the keyboard because we can't get at it. So that's step 2, and that's done. We're now going to start step 3, which is from the other side. Probably. Just depends if there's any screws. So we'll open it up now. Let's see if the keyboard comes loose. Okay, looks like the keyboard's now coming loose. Yeah. Okay, so the keyboard's now come loose. Pop that away. In fact, there aren't any screws or anything. So I'm going to just lift up the connector there, you can see, and the keyboard comes away. So I'll just write on step 3, and I'll write keyboard from front. Step 4, return to back. And the motherboard is now completely free. So that's the motherboard out of the computer. So, diagram again. And I'm just going to remove the hinges now. So I'm just going to draw the hinges again. On the previous diagram, the hinges will just be a circle with no number next to it, because they weren't removed. Okay, if you look at that, circles not removed. That one isn't a screw. So we know that on step 2 we don't remove those screws. So let's remove those now. That one's different again, so that's 27. $27, 27, I think. Yep, 27. And this one is 27. Lift the hinges away, and I think the front, and there we are. So now the displays come away from it. Obviously we could carry on now and take off this sensor here, the touchpad and other bits and pieces, but the idea of this is just to simply show our method. So now what we're going to do is we're going to return the laptop back to the state it was in before. So put the hinges back down, and first step is to put in the screws that are in compartment number 27. So we'll do that first. Now, because all these screws are exactly the same, it doesn't actually matter where they go. If you're not sure if a screw is the same, on some Apple products there can be ½ millimeter difference in length. If you're not sure, just give them their own compartment. Only put them in the same one if you're absolutely certain that the screws are exactly the same. Okay, so that's the 2 hinges back in place. So that was all of step 4 done. Back to step 3, so it was the keyboard back in place from the front. Oh, actually we missed writing on. Then remove motherboard. Okay, so that was step 4. So step 3 is to put the motherboard back. Just place it back in place, and then attach the keyboard again from the other side. So keyboard, so keyboard is now attached to the motherboard again. Close the lid, turn it back over, spin it back round. Okay, so we're now back to step 2. and we can return all the screws to where they should be. So the fan screws are number 26, so they can go back in. Okay, that's number 26. 25, we have the screw here, we have this cable, and there was another one, in fact there are two more, yep, two more. One is here, and then the next one is just over here. Okay, so they're the ones holding that in place. 24 is the screw for the Wi-Fi. Right, so I'm going to put the Wi-Fi back in and follow the route with the cables. Now, if you're taking this apart, if you're taking an item apart and it could be a while before you put it back together again, you can draw the route of the cables on the diagram, which often helps. But with this, there are little blocks with cable holders, which is how I know where it goes. So this is number 24, and because of the diagram, I know that there's nothing in the left screw, and it goes into the right screw hole. Okay, they're done. So I'm now going to put the connectors, the electrical connectors, back in place. On the video, and this appears to be for the sensor or whatever it is at that side. Okay, so they're all back in place now. And anything else? We can look at this diagram. The only missing screw holes, sorry, the only holes where there's no screw are shown as X's. So we know we've completed step 2. We can now move to step 1. So we can put the hard disk back in. And put the back on. Okay, so these bottom 3 screws are labelled 21. So put these in. And we know which way round it was because the diagram shows that battery's at the top. Okay, they're all back in place. So now on to number 22. That's these middle ones, which are labelled keyboard. Let's make sure the keyboard's in place correctly before I start doing the screws up. I know it needs to clip in place. So that's in place, so the screws should go through into the keyboard. Now with the keyboard in place, I'm going to screw it in. So that's the screws labelled 22. Just making sure that it's sitting correctly, which it is still. And then we just have the memory module to go back into place, the soldered in. That's now in. The door and the final screw, which is number 23 off the diagram. The SD card blank, and finally the battery. And we should now have one correctly reassembled Samsung laptop computer. Thanks.